Hello, everyone. Welcome to the channel. I'd like to talk today about Augustine, St. Augustine. He's regarded as the greatest of all the church fathers, and for a very good reason. He lived about 1600 years ago, and many people today are still reading his works. One of his most famous works was called the Confessions. There was also the City of God. These are very important works that are still influencing the church right to this day, 1600 years later. And they say he is the greatest church father because most theologians agree with that, and he's also the most quoted writer in terms of the church councils and also right up to the present day in regard to the modern catechism. He's called Augustine of Hippo because he was a bishop here in this North African city for the last 35 years of his life. His father, Patricius, was a pagan, but his mother, Monica, was a very devout Christian and had a big influence on his life. However, as a teenager, he rejected Christianity and went to live with an older woman who bore him a son. He lived with her for 15 years, actually. Throughout his 20s, he was a rather restless character, restless, that is, in a search for truth. He was deeply influenced by a heresy known as Manichaeism, but they appeared to explain the problem of evil. They had a rather simplistic idea. The world was based on a dualistic system which believed in two gods, a bad god and a good god. The good god produced or created the spiritual world, and the bad god created the physical world, and there's continuous conflict between these two forces. It seemed to explain a lot in a simplistic way, but by his late 20s, Augustine had begun to tire of this, became disillusioned with a lot of philosophy and Manichaeism, and also he began to look at the Christian message in a new way by the time he reached his early 30s. So by his early 30s, Augustine's life began to take a new, very different direction, a new direction towards Christianity. He was greatly influenced, of course, by Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, who was a very convinced speaker himself, a very strong Christian. And in the year 386, at the age of 32, Augustine heard a childlike voice in a garden. The voice said, "Take and read." He was very impressed by this experience. He went home immediately, opened the Bible and read one of Paul's letters, which became a major turning point in his life. It was actually basically from this point onwards that he surrendered his life to Christianity and to God, and he was baptized the following year by Bishop Ambrose. A few years later, he was ordained a priest, and in 395, at the insistence of the local population, he became Bishop of Hippo. He remained there for the rest of his life for the next 35 years until he died in 430 at the age of 76. And during this time as bishop, he was immensely influential. He was a very busy man. He wrote endless letters. He fought heresies such as Dotanism and Pelagianism. And his thinking was so deep and clear that he also influenced other bishops, even in his own generation. And his advice and counsel was sought all over Europe. So his writings have since become extremely influential, and a whole generations of church theologians and church leaders ever since. And it's for this reason that he's regarded as the greatest of all the church fathers. So Augustine was bishop for 35 years, from the time he was about 41 till he died when he was 76 years of age. And during that time, he was deeply involved in many controversies. One of the great controversies of his time was a Christian sect known as Dotanists. They actually believed that clergy who had given up the books, given up the scriptures, and who caved in under times of persecution, that they were basically not capable afterwards of administering the sacraments of the church. Augustine, however, took a very different view on this. He argued strongly that saying that the validity of the church depended on priests and bishops was the wrong approach. As far as he was concerned, the sacraments depended solely on Christ and not on the purity of a bishop or a priest. So for Augustine, Christ is the only true source of all the sacraments. So this became basically a foundational principle of Catholic theology in the decades and centuries afterwards. During his early years, Augustine worked hard to persuade the Dotanists to rejoin the church. However, he's criticized sometimes because in later years he supported state intervention in order to maintain the unity of the church. Augustine saw the church sort of as a mixed bag of saints and sinners, whereas Dortonists would have been heretics with elitist tendencies. Augustine believed all humans are born with a wounded nature. He believed people had an inclination, a natural inclination to do the wrong thing. That's why stealing a few pears as a teenager had a deep impact on him when he reflected on this event. It wasn't the value of the pears, but the thrill of doing wrong that encouraged these young lads to act as they did. Augustine came to believe that only God's grace can remove this inclination towards wrongdoing from the human mind. He went further actually to say that such grace is a free gift from God and that it cannot be earned by human effort, and it enables both faith and good works to take place. However, people can respond to God's grace. This became a foundational teaching of Catholic theology. However, during the Reformation, some of the reformers, especially Calvin, carried this concept a bit too far in regard to God's grace. Calvin believed that God's grace is everything and human will stands for nothing, thereby claiming that basically all humanity are predestined to either heaven or hell. However, this is basically a distortion of what Augustine was saying and thinking, and it's now rejected actually by the vast majority of Christian denominations around the world actually. The main problem with the theory of predestination is that it depends too strongly on the writings of Paul, and it fails to take adequate account of what Christ said repeatedly in terms of his call to keep the commandments, all of which depends on the human will of course. One of the main reasons Augustine was so influential is that he expressed his ideas very clearly as a writer, which was seen actually very clearly in his great work, The Confessions. This was written about the end of the 4th century. This is considered one of the great classics of Christian literature. As a young bishop in his early 40s, Augustine looks back on his life in this book, and he writes a brilliant work of autobiography and spiritual meditation. He basically remembers and recounts the restless search for truth in his 20s and his youth, and his time with the Manichaeans, his ambition. He was always very ambitious to be a great writer. He lived in a relationship with an older woman, and finally, in his early 30s, his conversion to Christianity with the help of Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, another church father, of course, which you can subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see that later. Augustine also reflects on the soul's longing to be at one with God, and one of his great phrases is, "The heart is restless," or "Our heart is restless until it rests in you." So the Confessions are basically widely read and had a huge impact on Christian thought, inspiring generations of bishops and priests and indeed lay readers as well to reflect on their own spiritual journey. Augustine also spent a lot of time and energy fighting another heresy known as Pelagianism. They were founded actually by a British monk who he was a great intellectual. He taught in Rome and North Africa, and they were strong believers in the power of the human will and that people could live moral lives if they chose to do so. Pelagius actually denied the whole idea of original sin, and especially in the Augustinian sense. Pelagius believed that original sin was nothing more than a bad example, but it did not really affect humanity directly, or there was no inheritance or anything like that. He denied all that sort of thing. So this denial of the fallen nature of humanity was thus a denial of the need for divine grace. This put him very much in opposition to Augustine. On the other hand, Augustine believed in the people are basically incapable of living sinless lives and thus very much in need of divine grace. And this is the heart of the crucifixion and is the heart of the Christian message as well. Another great work of Augustine is known as The City of God, and in fact I'd say his greatest work by far. City of God is it's written towards the end of his life, actually, in the last couple of decades of his life, from 413 to 426. He died in 434 years later. It was prompted by the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410. Basically, pagans blamed Christians for the fall of the Roman Empire. And they believed Christians caused people to lose faith in the old Roman gods, and this angered them, leading to the collapse of the empire. However, Augustine wrote The City of God to reject these claims and also to address wider theological issues, actually. And in it, he actually contrasted two imaginary cities, the city of man with the city of God. Augustine claimed that the city of man is built on pride, greed, obsessions with power and money and glory, And this often has its own internal conflicts and internal inconsistencies, sort of leads to an inevitable downfall in many cases, as happened in the case of Rome. So Augustine contrasted this with the city of God, which is defined as service to mankind, concepts such as service and truth and justice. And Augustine showed clearly that both of these two cities can coexist and have coexisted right throughout history. His work actually explores the heart of Augustine thought in many ways and deals with issues such as good and evil, the concept of a just war, human free will, God's grace, and actually the ultimate destiny of humanity. And Augustine argues that earthly kingdoms rise and fall, but the city of God goes on forever. So it's a brilliant work. He invites Christians to see themselves as strangers in a foreign land and just passing through to God's eternal kingdom. So the city of God is regarded as one of the most influential works in history, and Augustine is regarded as Christianity's greatest theologian. So if you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the channel, and I'll be doing other videos of similar nature in the future. Thank you for watching for today.